I grew up in a small town surrounded by lakes, each with its own quirks and legends. But there was one lake everyone whispered about, Lake Holloway. It wasn't the biggest or the prettiest, but it had a reputation. People said it was cursed, though no one could agree on what kind of curse. Some claimed it was bottomless. Others said boats had disappeared there without a trace. But for me, it was just a lake, a quiet, secluded spot where I could fish without interruption. That summer, I had just gotten a new kayak, a sleek green beauty that I couldn't wait to break in. Lake Holloway seemed like the perfect spot. The tree-lined banks provided ample shade, and the fish were plentiful, or so I'd been told. I packed my gear early one Saturday morning and headed out, my kayak strapped securely to the roof of my car. The road to the lake was as quiet as the water itself. Thick fog clung to the trees, giving the morning an otherworldly feel. By the time I reached the shore, the sun was starting to burn through the mist, casting an orange glow across the water. I unloaded my kayak, strapped on my gear, and pushed off. The lake was serene, almost too serene. The only sounds were the soft splash of my paddle and the occasional chirp of birds. I paddled out to the center, where the water was deep and still, and dropped my line. For the first hour, I caught nothing. Then, just as I was considering moving closer to the shore, my line went taut. The fight was brief but exhilarating, and soon I had a respectable-sized bass flopping in the bottom of my kayak. I cast again and hooked another within minutes. Things were finally looking up, but then I heard it, a faint splash, followed by another and another, coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't the sound of a fish jumping. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone wading through the water. I turned, scanning the shoreline, but saw nothing. Probably just a deer, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I cast my line again, forcing myself to focus. But as the hours wore on, the sense of unease grew. The splashes became more frequent, and I could swear I saw ripples in the water where there shouldn't have been any. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw it. A figure was standing on the shore, half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was another fisherman, but something about the way they stood, completely still, staring in my direction, made my skin crawl. I raised my hand to wave, but they didn't react. Instead, they took a step into the water. "Hey," I called out. "Can I help you?" No response. They just kept walking, the water rising to their knees, then their waist. By the time it reached their chest, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't swimming or floating. It was sinking, as though being pulled down by something unseen. I paddled toward the shore, my heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I shouted, but by the time I reached the spot where they'd been, the water was still. No bubbles, no ripples, nothing. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Then I saw it, a dark shape just beneath the surface, drifting slowly toward my kayak. It was large, too large to be a fish, and moving with purpose. Before I could react, something struck the bottom of my kayak, hard enough to make it wobble. I screamed and paddled as fast as I could, heading for the opposite shore. Whatever was beneath me followed, bumping the kayak every few seconds, as if toying with me. I finally reached the shallows and leapt out, dragging the kayak onto the bank. The water behind me was still again, as though nothing had happened. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I grabbed my gear and sprinted back to my car, my heart hammering in my chest. By the time I reached home, my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely unlock the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the splashes, the sound of something striking the kayak, and the image of that figure disappearing into the lake. The next morning, I checked the local news, but there was nothing. No reports of a missing person, no mention of Lake Holloway at all. I haven't been back to that lake since. Every time I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed out there just a little longer. Maybe the lake wasn't cursed. Maybe it was just hungry. I was 16 the first time I went night fishing. My uncle, Dave, was an experienced angler who swore by the idea that the best catches came under the cover of darkness. I wasn't sure if it was true, but I loved the thought of spending a night out on the water. There was something thrilling about the idea of casting your line into the unknown, with only the moon and stars to light the way. That summer, Dave invited me to join him at a remote spot called Bramble Creek. The name was a bit misleading. It wasn't a creek at all, but a long, narrow lake surrounded by dense woods. It was so far off the beaten path that you'd miss it if you didn't know where to look. "This place is special," Dave told me as we loaded up the truck, "but you've got to respect it." I didn't ask what he meant by that. We arrived just after sunset, the horizon still painted with streaks of orange and pink. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. Dave launched the rowboat while I carried our gear to the shore. The lake was eerily still, its surface like glass, reflecting the darkening sky. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. By the time we paddled to the center, night had fully set in. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting long shadows across the water. We baited our hooks and cast our lines, settling in for what I expected to be a quiet, uneventful night. It wasn't. The first few hours were slow. We caught a couple of small fish, but nothing worth keeping. Around midnight, as the air grew colder, Dave leaned over and whispered, "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze. On the far side of the lake, just beyond the tree line, a faint light flickered. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but it didn't move like one. It stayed in place, glowing softly, then dimming, as though someone was holding a lantern and shielding it with their hand. "Is someone out there?" I asked, my voice low. Dave didn't answer right away. He just stared at the light, his face unusually tense. "We'll stay on this side," he said finally, reeling in his line. "Don't worry about it." I tried to brush it off, but the light unnerved me. It seemed wrong, though I couldn't explain why. We continued fishing, though the mood had shifted. The silence felt heavier, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. Then came the splash. It was loud and sudden, breaking the stillness like a gunshot. We both turned toward the sound, but there was nothing, just ripples spreading across the surface. "Probably a fish," I said, though I didn't believe it. Dave didn't respond. He was staring at something in the water, his face pale. "Time to go," he said abruptly, his voice shaking. "What? Why?" I asked, glancing around. "We just got here." "Pull up the anchor," he snapped. "Now." I didn't argue. As I leaned over to grab the anchor rope, I caught a glimpse of something in the water. A dark shape, long and sinuous, moving just beneath the surface. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. We paddled back to shore in silence. The light on the far side of the lake was gone, but the air felt wrong, like it was pressing down on us. As we loaded the truck, I finally asked Dave what was going on. "You remember what I said about respecting this place?" he asked, his voice low. "There's something in that lake. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know, but I've seen enough to know when it's time to leave." He wouldn't say anything else, no matter how much I pressed him. We drove back to town in silence, the tension in the truck almost unbearable. The next day, I tried to find out more about Bramble Creek. I asked around, but no one seemed to know much about it. A few older locals mentioned stories about strange lights and unexplained drownings, but most dismissed it as folklore. I haven't been back to Bramble Creek since that night. I still don't know what we saw, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that dark shape gliding beneath the water and the faint flicker of that impossible light on the shore. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go on a fishing trip to celebrate the end of summer. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment plans where none of us thought much beyond packing our rods and enough snacks to last the weekend. Our destination was a remote lake about 2 hours out of town, known simply as Big Hollow. The lake was vast, surrounded by thick forest and dotted with small, nameless islands. "Perfect spot for some serious fishing," my friend Matt had said. "No distractions, just us and the water." We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The water glimmered gold in the fading light, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. Our plan was simple: paddle out to one of the islands, set up camp, and fish through the night. We packed our gear into a small rowboat and pushed off. The lake was eerily quiet, with only the sound of oars slicing through the water. It took about half an hour to reach the island we'd picked, a small, rocky patch of land with just enough flat space for our tents. We set up camp quickly, eager to start fishing before the light disappeared completely. By the time we cast our lines, the sky was a deep shade of indigo, and the first stars were beginning to appear. At first, everything was perfect. The air was cool and crisp, the water was calm, and the fish were biting. We joked and laughed, taking turns reeling in our catches. But as the hours passed, the mood began to shift. It started with the fog. A thick, rolling mist crept in from the far side of the lake, blanketing the water in an eerie, white haze. It moved unnaturally fast, swallowing the stars' reflection and leaving us in near total darkness. The only light came from our lantern, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance along the water's edge. "Creepy," Jake muttered, peering into the fog. "Feels like something out of a horror movie." "Relax," Matt said, though his voice wavered. "It's just fog." But then came the sound. A low, mournful wail echoed across the lake, rising and falling like the cry of some distant animal. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from all around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. No one answered. We stood frozen, listening as the wail faded, replaced by a soft, splashing sound, like something or someone moving through the water. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the shore, but the beam was swallowed by the fog. "We should pack up," Jake said, his voice trembling. "I don't like this." As we debated what to do, the splashing grew louder. Then, from the edge of the water, a figure emerged. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like it didn't quite know how to use its body. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the figure let out a guttural growl and started toward us. "Run!" Matt shouted. We scrambled back to the boat, tripping over rocks and each other in our panic. The thing was fast, its lanky arms reaching out as it closed the distance. We barely managed to shove off in time, paddling frantically as the figure stopped at the water's edge, its glowing eyes following us into the fog. We didn't stop until we reached the main shore, our arms aching from the effort. When we looked back, the island was hidden in the mist, but we could still hear the faint sound of splashing, as if it were pacing along the shoreline, waiting. We didn't speak much on the drive home. None of us wanted to admit what we'd seen, or what we thought we'd seen. But we all agreed on one thing. We weren't going back to Big Hollow. Sometimes, I dream about that night. I hear the wailing, see the glowing eyes, and feel the cold, damp fog pressing in. And every time, I wake up with the same question. What would have happened if we hadn't made it to the boat in time? I don't think I want to know. A few years ago, I was invited to join my friend Carl and his dad for a weekend fishing trip. They were headed to Blackwater Marsh, a sprawling wetland tucked deep in the woods about 3 hours from town. Carl's dad had been fishing there for decades and swore it was the best place to catch trophy-sized bass. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but the idea of spending a weekend in nature sounded great. We arrived in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The marsh was beautiful, its glassy water reflecting the towering cypress trees and thick blankets of moss hanging from their branches. But as soon as we stepped out of the truck, I felt an odd unease. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was strange. Not peaceful, but unnatural, like the marsh was holding its breath. Carl's dad didn't seem bothered. He led us to a small, rickety dock where an aluminum boat was tied up. We loaded our gear and set off into the water, weaving through narrow channels flanked by dense reeds. As we paddled deeper into the marsh, the trees grew thicker, their twisted roots reaching into the water like skeletal hands. The sunlight faded quickly, leaving us in a murky twilight. We set up camp on a small patch of dry land surrounded by water. It was more of an island than anything, barely big enough for the 2 tents we'd brought. By the time we got a fire going, The sun had disappeared completely, and the marsh was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the flickering flames and the faint glow of the moon. Fishing at night turned out to be surprisingly fun. Carl and I sat at the edge of the island, casting our lines into the inky water and trading stories about school and summer plans. His dad stayed close to the fire, occasionally glancing around the marsh like he was expecting something. "Ever hear the story about the marsh watcher?" Carl asked suddenly. I shook my head. "What's that?" "It's just an old legend," he said, smirking. "My dad says people who fish here sometimes see a figure watching them from the reeds. They call it the Watcher because it doesn't do anything. It just stares. Creepy, right?" "Cut it out, Carl," his dad said sharply, his voice unusually tense. "That's not something to joke about." Carl looked surprised but didn't argue. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that crept in at his dad's tone. As the night wore on, the marsh grew quieter. The chirping frogs and buzzing insects that had filled the air earlier seemed to vanish all at once. Even the water felt still, like the entire marsh had gone to sleep. Then I saw it. At the edge of the reeds, just barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure. It stood completely still, partially hidden by the tall grass. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. "Hey, Carl," I whispered, nudging him. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze and froze. "What the—" The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. Its eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, gleamed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. "Dad?" Carl called out, his voice shaking. "There's someone out there." His dad was at our side in an instant, holding a flashlight. He shone it toward the reeds, but the figure was gone. The beam of light revealed nothing but rippling water and swaying grass. "Get back to the fire," his dad said firmly. "Now." We didn't argue. As we sat by the flames, his dad stood at the edge of the island, scanning the water with the flashlight. "We're leaving at first light," he said finally, his voice low. The rest of the night was tense. None of us slept much. Every sound, the rustle of reeds, the splash of fish, even the crackle of the fire, felt amplified, like the marsh was alive and watching us. Just before dawn, as the first light of morning seeped through the trees, we began packing up. Carl and I loaded the gear into the boat while his dad kept watch. I thought we were in the clear until I glanced back toward the reeds. The figure was there again, closer this time. It stood at the water's edge, its long arms hanging limply at its sides. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. "Dad," Carl whispered. "It's back." His dad didn't look. "Get in the boat. Now." We pushed off, paddling as fast as we could. The figure didn't follow, but I swear I saw it watching us, its head slowly tilting to one side as we disappeared into the channel. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. As we loaded up, I asked Carl's dad what he thought it was. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "The marsh has things in it you don't want to know about. Leave it alone." I haven't been back to Blackwater Marsh since. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I don't want to. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think about the Watcher. How it stood so still, how it seemed to wait, and I wonder if it's still there, keeping its silent vigil over the water.